Hi, this is Grace. I'm going to be doing a presentation over the cross and the lynching tree, chapter 1, which is the cross and the lynching tree in the Black experience. And there was just a lot covered in this chapter, and I had a lot to say, so I thought y'all might get more out of it if I did it in a PowerPoint format so you can kind of follow along visually. The cross as a paradox. So Cone sort of starts out this chapter by presenting the cross as we know it within the Christian faith as a paradox because crucifixion was a punishment reserved for insurrectionists and rebels, as Cone writes. It really was for the worst of the worst criminals, and it was viewed as the most humiliating, most shameful, most painful, sort of slow death. And it was very much a public spectacle that everyone came out to see. And the fact that that Jesus' death on the cross happened and then he was able to come and rise again and save us all from our sins sort of inverted the world's value system at the time. How can hope come from, utter defeat and death? And Cone writes that message really resonated with the Black audience at the time because of everything that they had been suffering from, everything that they were going through. Jesus' death and then further resurrection on the cross showed these people that despite everything that was happening to them, everything that they were being subjected to, they wouldn't be defeated. Something really important that Cone points out is that the widespread abuse of Black people didn't end after emancipation. I think there's this sort of misconception out there that once Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that things were fine and normal and good for Black people, and that just wasn't true. Black suffering continued well after the Civil War. It just took on a different form. And this really presented a struggle to keep the faith and the hope alive within the Black community because of all of the horrible abuse and torture that they had to go through. And that especially becomes prevalent when the lynching era begins in 1880. And lynching becomes such a powerful symbol in the Black community. It almost sort of formed a just ever-present storm cloud over the heads of the Black people during that time. It was something that was always present, something they always had to worry about, something that was always happening in their communities. They always knew people who it was happening to, so lynching was just something that was inescapable. So within the chapter, Cone sort of provides us a brief history of lynching so we can have more context. And something important that I think he points out is that Black people were no longer seen as property like they were before the Civil War. Before the Civil War, slave owners could abuse, rape, really just torture their slaves, but they couldn't kill them because they were a money-making mechanism for them. That's not true anymore because now that slavery isn't present, people sort of have to take that abuse into everyday life. And not just Black people were lynched. That's another important thing to point out. It was people of all races. And lynching, again, was really an extra-legal punishment. Lynching actually originated during the Revolutionary War, Cone writes, with either Judge William Lynch or Judge Charles Lynch. And it was something that was done to punish Tory sympathizers. But then it sort of took on this new meaning after the Revolutionary War. And something else that Cone points out is that Western movies really romanticize the idea of lynching, like as almost a resolution. At the end of Western movies, the bad guy gets hung and the whole town celebrates, and that really just sort of provided propaganda to this idea of lynching. And it also was really fueled by the fact that after Reconstruction, Southern whites really felt that they had been wrong. And this is what leads to the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, whose real goal was to redeem the South, to its former glory or whatever. And they did this really primarily through lynching and creating lynch mobs. And the court systems were really unjust at that time. You had white judges and white juries. And like I mentioned before, there was a lot of propaganda going around. A lot of novels were being written. A lot of short films were being shown, especially in the South. At the end of the lynching period, there were 5,000 Black lynching victims, as due to all of these different factors. Something really important that Cohn points out is that if you were Black during this time, it was essentially a death sentence. For many people, it felt like not if they would be lynched, but when. And the widespread belief among white supremacists was that Black people didn't deserve any rights and that killing Black people was the white man's right. And they didn't have to answer for these crimes because the justice system was so corrupt at the time. And something that really contributed to all of these misconceptions was that the narrative surrounding Black people really changed from before the Civil War to after. During the period of slavery, Black people were sort of seen as harmless and innocent, probably because they were viewed as property. But once they gained freedom, they were seen as more threatening and more harmful. And so this kind of also goes back to the book that we just read, Myths America Lives By, because it shows how the belief that America is a white Christian and chosen nation contributed to all of these ongoing lynchings. White people saw it as their divine right to cleanse the nation of these unjust criminals in their eyes, and they saw it as their divine right to protect the people, protect this Christian, quote-unquote Christian nation. And a big part of what they wanted to protect the nation from was this imagined Black man's lust for white women. Anytime a Black man had relations with a white woman, even when it was consensual, the narrative was always turned into rape. And anytime a Black man was accused of rape, it led to lynching, just immediately. And this really was justified by President Roosevelt at the time. He referred to rape as pretty much the worst crime anyone could do, which only put fuel on the fire. And an example of this, the picture I have to the right, is the Scottsboro boys. They were 9 Black boys who were accused of raping 2 white women and sentenced to life in prison, and some of them were sentenced to the death penalty, I believe. It's just really a good example of what was happening back then. Cohn also points out that lynching was an American reality, not just a Southern reality. It really was taking place anywhere large groups of Black people lived. And it wasn't just the act of lynching, but it was also excruciating torture and humiliation leading up to the actual lynching. Like I mentioned before, it was a public spectacle. Whole families came. It was like a day-long event where they could take turns. Women and children could take turns torturing the lynching victim before he or she was killed. It was really a cause to celebrate their whiteness. There was many pictures being taken, a lot of things like that. It was a very public event. And because it was so public, you would think that people in positions of authority would do something, but they didn't. Many Black students wrote letters to Presidents McKinley and Harding, begging them to do something, trying to show them what was going on, and they were essentially ignored and swept under the rug, which really just rendered Black people powerless, and it was a really defeating time because they couldn't stick up for themselves. Really, any form of self-defense, be it verbal or physical or even written, would inevitably lead to lynching. Cohn writes that something that provided a lot of hope and stability for Black people during this time was blues music and juke joints, where they could go and listen to blues music being performed live for them, and they could dance and they could celebrate and be around other Black people who were being subjected to the same horrible things. And through all of this, they really fought back the dehumanization that the white people at the time were really trying to impose on them. And it really offered them a sense of hope, and it provided a real catharsis, being able to come together and find community and find support. Albert Murray wrote that the blues was a disposition to confront the most unpromising circumstances and make the most of what little there is to go on, regardless of the odds. So writing and performing blues music was really a way for these people to put into words what they were feeling, what they were going through, and it provided them a sense of hope for the future. And it allowed them to assert loudly and exuberantly their somebodyness. When they were at these juke joints coming together as a community, they felt like they were somebody again. Again, white people really just tried to subject them to awful and horrible things and made them feel like they were less of a person, not even a person. And the ability to come together through music really helped them feel like people again. Cohn writes that through all these awful experiences that Black people had to go through, they found God in the gallows. And he writes that if lynching was equal to white power and Black death, then the cross was equal to divine power and Black life. So they really saw the cross as the opposite of what was going on with lynching. And in the face of the lynching environment and everything that was going on, they were able to look to the cross for a source of inspiration and hope. And when studying the Bible, they really looked to the gospel crucifixion narratives and the stories of Job and Jacob. And through these, they learned that trouble wouldn't lead to despair if they kept the faith. And they really just kept the cross at the center of their faith. Cohn wrote in the book that these people really knew what it was like to be crucified. They knew what it was like to be humiliated publicly, to be subjected to awful, violent things. They knew what it was like to be dehumanized, and they knew that Jesus went through the same thing and came out the other side. So that was just something that they kept with them, and that became the center of their faith. Cohn writes that the final word about Black life is not death on a lynching tree, but redemption in the cross. So people just sort of felt this kind of sense of peace, even if they were condemned to be lynched. Cohn writes that many people with a strong sense of faith were preaching out loud and praying out loud before being lynched, and just had this sense of calm and peace about them. And then they calmly and bravely walked to their death. And they just knew that what was waiting for them on the other side was greater than what they were going through at that moment. Cohn points out that despite the faith that they were able to find through their times of trial, they still really wrestled with their faith, and they wondered if God was even real. James Baldwin is quoted in the book as saying, "If God's love was so great, and if he loved all of his children, why were we the Blacks cast down so far?" But Cohn points out that despite everything they went through, the fact that these people were able to keep the faith gave them the courage to stand up and protest later on, specifically like the civil rights movement. The spiritual songs they sang became the soul of the movement, Cohn writes. The blues music that they wrote and sang together prepared people to fight because, like I said earlier, it humanized them and made them feel like people again. And the cross sent people protesting in the streets because they knew something better was coming and they wanted to fight for it. Okay, so my final question to all of you guys is, what is a modern day equivalent to lynching? And it doesn't have to be necessarily something violent, but just really anything you can come up with that's happening in our world today that makes one group of people feel lesser than another group.